Before I talk about applying binding to a mini quilt, let's first talk about trimming a mini quilt square. If you have a quilt top that has points that extend close to the edge that you want to preserve with your binding, like the points of this curved star, I recommend trimming 3/8 of an inch beyond any points that you want to preserve if you follow the machine binding information that I'm going to share with you next. I will also share at the end of this segment how you can sew with a true 1/4 inch seam allowance to the front of the quilt and then hand stitch to the back. So if that's an option that you would prefer, then you would just trim like you normally would, making sure that you have a 1/4 inch beyond any points that you want to preserve on the quilt top. So once you have your mini quilt top trimmed square, the next thing you will want to do is prepare a binding strip. So we are going to be using a single fold binding instead of a double fold binding. The reason for this is that a double fold binding has a lot more bulk and it's a lot more to manage on such a tiny make. So what's the difference between a single fold and a double fold binding? Well, a single fold binding is just going to be a single piece of fabric that is, in this case, I'm recommending 1.5 inches wide by the perimeter of your mini quilt top plus about 5 inches. A double fold binding is traditionally wider, so it's either 2 inches, 2¼ inches, or 2½ inches. Those are some typical binding width sizes for a double fold binding. And with a double fold binding, what happens is you take it to your ironing board and you press it in half before you apply it to your quilt. For a single fold binding, we're just going to leave it as it is at the full width of 1.5 inches. So the way that we would get started is, again, this is going to be for machine finishing both to the front and the back of the mini quilt. So we'll actually start by applying the binding to the back of the mini quilt. So we would line it up across the back, and the first seam that we want to sew, let me rotate this in an orientation so that you can see it the way the sewing machine would. You want the edge of your binding strip to start almost at the full side of your mini quilt. Let me switch over to another to show you another example of what I'm talking about. This is another mini quilt that is just a very simple fussy cut of an art gallery dragonfly print with some minimal quilting. This is a very small mini quilt, which kind of illustrates why going with a single fold binding is so important. In this case, the mini quilt is 3½ inches wide by only 2½ inches tall. So again, I've got the binding started on the back of this mini quilt. And when you have a mini quilt that is not square, so if it is rectangular, I always recommend that you start on the longest side. So whichever side is the longest for your mini quilt will be where you will start applying your binding. You'll line up your binding with the edge, right sides together. And before you get started, I recommend going ahead and doing your first miter and folding that back to get started. And only stitch 1 or 2 stitches up to that miter position using a 1/4 inch or a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. So a scant 1/4 inch being just a thread width smaller than a true 1/4 inch. So you'll be sewing that in, but only using a couple stitches. And because you're only using a couple of stitches, I recommend back stitching. So start up here, stitch forward to your miter about 2 stitches, and then back stitch and trim your threads. At this point, you would flip your binding up and then rotate your mini quilt, and then start sewing from the edge of the mini quilt to the next miter joint using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, which is shown here. So again, the first 1 or 2 stitches are taken on this side, the mini quilt was rotated, and it started from the very edge, and it sewed up to the next mitered corner, rotated, same thing happened again here, stitched all the way up to the next mitered corner, stopped before you overlap, and then flip this up and rotate and continue forward until you get back to the side where you started. When you get back to the side where you started, it will look like this. And I recommend, again, only doing maybe 3 or 4 stitches on this side to beyond the point. So once you have flipped it around and you've gotten back to the side where you've started and you did your initial stitches, only do 3 or 4 stitches and then back stitch just to secure the binding to the first edge of the quilt. Then what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to fold the edges of the binding strip back. And I recommend doing this about halfway down the length of the mini quilt. So I will start by folding one edge of the binding back, getting a nice edge, and then I will fold the next one, leaving a very slight gap. So this is probably about a 1/16 of an inch gap. I don't want it to be perfect because things will move around a little bit. And this is going to create a line that I can join and then create a straight seam to join my binding strip. This is not going to be a mitered join, just because I'm going to show you how little room there is to work and manipulate. And this is a larger mini quilt. This one is, look at it, it is about 4.5 inches on an edge length. So to join the binding, what I then do is I'm going to pinch the mini quilt together, and then I'm going to line up those creases, and then I can pin that together along the crease and stitch along the folded line. So stitch right along that fold and make sure that they are pinned together, move the fabric around until you have it together, stitch right on the line, and then using your rotary cutter and a ruler or just some scissors, eyeball about a 1/4 inch seam allowance, so cut that back, press your seam open, and then you will take it back to your machine and with a 1/4 inch seam allowance finish sewing the binding down to the back of the quilt. Once the binding is sewn to the back of the quilt, what you're going to do is you're going to just pop the binding around like you normally would. I recommend taking the mini quilt at this point to your ironing table and using your iron to get a nice crisp press and press the binding away from the back of the quilt. And then when you get to the front of the mini quilt, you're going to have this raw edge of the binding going all the way around. So how do you prepare and finish things off nicely? I recommend starting in the corner of the mini quilt and folding in until the edge of the binding is just at the top of the mini quilt and giving a nice squeeze and pressing that in. And so going around to all the corners and following that same advice, folding in the binding until the raw edge of the binding is at the top of the mini quilt. So once you have done that around all 4 corners of the quilt top, this is a little bit harder because this one isn't sewn all the way around. The next thing that I do is I kind of grab 2 corners at a time and I make a little tug, and that sort of gives me an idea of where this is going to fold, and then I just work my fingers in and fold the binding in by hand so that now my raw edges are enclosed and I can pull the binding in taut, and I will take this to my sewing machine and I will now top stitch around the edge of this folded and prepared binding. And when I come up to a corner, it would be just like preparing any other corner on binding. You do your miter, and the goal will be to stop with your needle down right at the intersection where that miter overlaps. So you'll be doing a top stitch, you'll stitch up, you'll get your needle into this overlap, and with the needle down, you will stop. Once the needle is down, you'll lift your presser foot, rotate the mini quilt, put your presser foot back down, and then you'll be able to sew next along the seam until you come up to your next mitered joint. So this is another example, again, of a simple mini quilt. It's just a fussy cut print with some minimal quilting, and the binding's been flipped around to the front, and it's been pulled and folded in so that the raw edges will be encased. And again, when I'm starting to sew and do the top stitch for the binding, I recommend starting about halfway down the length of the longest edge of the mini quilt, just to have a little bit of room to maneuver. So again, you would start about halfway down, you'd do your top stitch, you'd come up to a corner, you'd fold it in for your miter, make sure your needle hits right at that overlap, and with the needle down, you'll stop, lift your presser foot, rotate the mini quilt, and then continue top stitching until you get to the next corner. And again, stop with the needle down, lift the presser foot, rotate the mini quilt, and continue until you get all the way around the edge of the mini quilt. And what will happen is that the top stitching will look something like this, and I haven't quite finished it, just so that I can show you that when it's on the back, I pull my threads for the top stitching to the back, and then I will use a needle to bury my threads into the back of the quilt. And you can also see that from the top stitching, that line will fall just inside of where the binding was stitched down to the back of the quilt. Nice and neat. So if you're looking at this and you're thinking, I haven't done machine binding and I don't know if I have the skills to do that. First of all, mini quilts are a great place to learn new techniques, and that's where I have perfected, I don't know if I can say that I've perfected machine binding, but it's where I've gotten a lot of practice and felt a lot more comfortable doing machine binding, is through making all of the mini quilts that I've made over the years. A few tips, again, because we are sewing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance to the back of the quilt, and then we're folding it in. At the front, it's going to be a slightly wider binding than a 1/4 inch finished. So if you have any points on the front of your quilt, I recommend, again, trimming 3/8 of an inch beyond those points to preserve them, so when you're putting the binding on. But if you don't like that, and you don't like the way that this machine binding looks as a finished look, you can go through this same process, but you can start on the front of the quilt with your binding. So in this case, you would get your binding strip, line it up with the first edge that you want to start with, making sure that the tail of your binding strip starts close to the edge. And you will do your first miter at the corner, get that folded and set up. Once that is established, that folded miter, which is challenging to do upside down apparently, you will put in 1 to 2 stitches with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then work your way, just as I described earlier, all the way around the front of the quilt. You'll fold back your tails and do your join, your straight join at the center of the edge, and then finish sewing the binding down. And then when you finish sewing it to the front of the quilt, the same process will apply. You'll flip it around to the back, you'll fold it down to create a nice finished encased seam on the back of the quilt, and in this case you can hand stitch it down to the back. And that way you can get your true 1/4 inch binding finish on the front of the quilt. And that's just if you want to have a traditional binding to finish your mini quilt. You can also explore doing facing and leaving the edges of your binding of your mini quilt raw, or whatever technique it is that you want to look at and explore.